Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Welcome to our panel, Sustainable and Environmentally Friendly Textile Development, as part of the Rotary Africa Centennial Conference. I'll be your host for this panel, and my name is Kutay Sarıtosun, member of Rotary E-Club District 9400 and Director of Fashion Brands at Blue Sign in Switzerland. With climate change, diminishing natural resources, and environmental issues, sustainability has definitely become a vital aspect of running a business. Textile industry is known to have a very large environmental footprint. So today, we'll be discussing the current status, challenges, and the future regarding sustainability in the fashion and textile industry in general, and also with a focus on Africa. And we'll be hearing the insights of our esteemed panelists. Joining us today is a group of global thought leaders, and I have the pleasure to welcome Anyango Mipinga, Creative Director of Anyango Mipinga and founder of Free as a Human Foundation. Welcome, Anyango. Samantha Pattinson, CEO of Red Carpet Green Dress. Welcome, Samantha. And Skandar Negasi, CEO of Trade and Fairs Group, Messe Frankfurt representative for East Africa and co-organizer of African Sourcing and Fashion Week. Welcome all. So starting with where we are today, let's open up the discussion to the panel. We've been talking about sustainability in the textile and fashion industry for many years now. And given the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, what does that mean to you now? Where do you see the current status of the global fashion and textile industry at the moment? And why is sustainability in fashion important? So Anyango, shall we start with you?
Sure. So in terms of sustainability in fashion, like if we take Goal 8, for instance, it emphasizes promoting sustainable employment and economic growth and providing fair employment opportunities. And we look at the global fashion scene and we see a lot of inequalities when it comes to employment of workers. And that's something that we really need to drive a message forward that something needs to change, right? We need to pay our workers fairly. Sustainability is not just about picking one thing that you think you want to achieve and then saying, oh, my brand is sustainable. It goes all the way down to how you source your materials, all the way down to who you're working with, how much you're paying them, and whether or not they're able to earn a living from producing clothing for you. Because at the end of the day, as a fashion brand, you don't have a brand without the people who are making your clothes.
So Samara, what are your thoughts on that? What is, in your opinion, what's the current status of the textile fashion industry with regards to sustainability?
Hi, well, first of all, I love what Anyango said, and I echo her thoughts very much. I think for me, when I look at sustainability in the textile and fashion industry, first of all, I think about the impact that this industry has. And it's so hard for people to understand how huge that impact is, but that environmental footprint comes from, and social footprint comes from everything from chemical use and greenhouse gas emissions to water consumption and rainforest destruction. So we have such a huge impact within the fashion industry, from sourcing our materials across to, as Anyango said, the people that are interacting and creating our products. And this model, this very linear model, isn't really looking like it's correcting itself quick enough. I mean, clothing represents 60% of textiles used globally. And we know that in the next 15 years, clothing production is going to double. So we have this huge footprint that we're responsible for. And when I think about the SDGs and how that ties into sustainability, I mean, Anyango already gave the example of a couple of them, but even if you think about responsible consumption and production, right now we're talking so much about circularity and the need to decouple economic growth from material extraction, because we can't continue with business as usual. And so that's one of the issues for me, that we have a business model that is producing garments and using textiles and using raw materials in an irresponsible way. And to align with that responsible goal, we have to look at reducing production. We have to look at more sustainable inputs in the process of production. But I also look at it from the perspective of materials. Like, we're relying so heavily on synthetics. We're relying on petroleum for materials like spandex and polyester and acrylic. And we know that these are not biodegradable. We know that they aren't aligned with the circular economy in the long term, unless we look at responsible production and the solutions for what do we do with the clothes and apparel that we're making once we're done with it. So I'm kind of excited about responsible production and consumption, looking at it from a new business model and looking at it from the inputs that we put into that model. But I think the last thing for me, especially around kind of the SDGs, is this focus on climate. And fashion has a huge input when it comes to actually aligning with the goals to impact climate change. And we know that we would contribute approximately 9 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of the things I'm passionate about, how do we decarbonize our supply chain from the machines that we use, the sewing machines that we use, the dye processes that we use, the materials that we extract, all the way across to the packaging, etc. So to align with that kind of goal of the climate change action for goal 13, I think decarbonisation is a thing that I'm kind of looking at a great deal as well. So it's all connected. I don't think you can decouple the sustainable development goals from the fashion industry and sustainability, because fashion is a business, it's full of people, and all of these different goals affect us in different ways.
Absolutely. The sustainable textile industry actually should revolve around, as you said, responsible production, responsible chemistry, and responsible use of resources. And how do, once you spend those resources to make the goods, how can you keep those goods in circulation as long as possible? Because you keep using new resources to make new goods all the time. And that brings us to your point that we have a linear take, use and dispose a linear model right now, and how can we change it to a circular model, in the sense that how can we keep the goods in circulation as long as possible, reuse, repair, recycle, right? Wonderful. And Skandar, what would be your take on this? What is our current status in the industry?
Yeah, I can only add to what Samantha and Anyango said. You know, the sustainable development goal here is becoming a darling for the Western countries. It's becoming a trendy word and trendy brand for the Western world. But if you see the African designers, for instance, they have always been sustainable. So they were sustainable by necessity, because they had a lack of resources that the Western designers or companies did not have. They always made sure that they are not creating too much of a waste. So with whatever they had, they were always sustainable in production. So for Africa, it's nothing new. It's a new thing for the Western world, for the Asian world, but not for Africa at all. The good thing is that Africa is now recognized by the sustainability activities that is happening now. And that's the good part for the African industry. When you go to the textile industry, textile manufacturing and apparel manufacturing, you see that Africa is doing that something positive that Asia was never doing. That means you look at the factories that are opening up in Africa. Most of them are eco-friendly factories. You won't find an eco-friendly factory in Asia, for instance. And even the Western countries, the Western sourcing companies, were not interested in the past to source from eco-friendly factories. But the thing has changed, and that's where Africa is coming into the whole game, and that's why I see a bright future for Africa when it comes to design and also manufacturing.
So sustainability is in the DNA of African designs, right? Traditionally, it's been so from the very beginning. And what I'm hearing from you is that now that production is moving into Africa, all of these factories, facilities that are being set up are set up in a sustainable way. So not only traditionally sustainability is in the DNA of the African fashion, but in the modern African fashion, sustainability is the rising star with regards to production and sourcing. Anyango, what's your take on all of this?
Well,
what's the current status of African demand for African fashion and design?
I can only speak frankly from the position of a designer who's in the industry, who's working in the business, because it's encouraging to hear all these idealistic views of what the industry is. But when you really sit down with African designers, you'll realize that it's not as rosy as it looks. We have a lot of retailers who are coming up right now who want to sell our products. However, the terms that they're offering us are terms that they would never offer any other designer. out there. So we have to pay attention to that. Because yes, every platform, I can tell you for a fact, every platform that has come up that is supporting African designers has approached me. But are the terms favorable for me to actually manufacture in a sustainable way and sell my products on those platforms? No. So that's what needs to change. If you're really going to invest in designers, you actually have to come in as a partner, right? Because a lot of platforms will come up. Maybe the only model that they're willing to offer a designer is a consignment model. But a designer has to then produce his goods in a sustainable way and meet their manufacturing minimums, right? So is this platform actually amplifying the work of a sustainable brand, or is it just sort of riding on the wave, you know? So there, we do need to look at these things, because at the end of the day, some of the retailers that will offer me the terms that are favorable happen to be the international ones. Yeah. And that's the reality, right? The ones on the continent and the ones that we want to work with because we believe in our products and we believe in serving our local communities aren't really offering us favorable terms for retail, right? So for me, I'll be more inclined to work with a buyer who's international, who's going to meet my wholesale minimums and is willing to give me the payment terms as well that I require in order for me to actually produce sustainably. Because remember, for you to be sustainable, it costs you triple to actually be sustainable. You're sourcing sustainable materials, which take more time to make, right? And if you're working with a factory that is looking at the environment and not using toxic dyes, they're not going to give you a cheap product. So being sustainable actually costs more money, which is why a lot of businesses aren't switching to sustainability.
So I'm a former designer as well. I actually am a self-taught designer who was in London, and I basically worked on the business side of fashion, but I had my own clothing label for 3 years, and I showcased in New York with it, and it was a really, really interesting experience, kind of being a self-funded designer that was doing women's wear at the time. And so I do understand the perspective of a designer because I'm a former designer myself. But one of my things with this statement that sustainability is more expensive, I actually like to say, no, sustainability isn't more expensive, exploitation is, because the reality is, first of all, citizens and consumers have a false idea about what the actual true cost of anything is. So when you're saying, oh, I have to pay more for these inputs, which is true, and it's also on the flip side, organic. So I work with all manner of fabrics with red carpet green dress. So I can say, yes, I know that if I get a GOTS certified material, or I get a material that has this certification like Ercotex or whatever the certification is, or whatever that process is, I might say that that's 30 to 40% more on average. That's the percentage you're looking at for that kind of extra level of kind of transparency or cleanliness of the textile or process of the dyes, etc. So there's that. But I also know that if I'm sourcing other materials, for example, a recycled material, that's an inherently less expensive, because the virgin material is always more expensive than the recycled material. So it's also dependent on what you're sourcing. But my thing about this statement around sustainability is more expensive, it really upsets me, because what the alternative to sustainability is subsidized. So what you actually think is cheaper is subsidized off people. It's subsidized off people's labor. It's subsidized off raw material. It's subsidized off farmers or factory workers being paid less than they should be. So we have this idea of this. I would say that this is more expensive because, let's say you're charging me £25 for this t-shirt when I could buy it for £7 here. That's more expensive, but actually it's not more expensive, because the true cost of what you're buying should be that price.
Whether we like it or not, I'm still being charged more for a sustainable product, for, you know, with that comes with certification, and there's all these implications. It's like I have everything right in front of me. So I'm ultimately going to have to charge my customers more.
Sustainability is not going to be a nice to have for brands in the upcoming years, because if you look at the online platforms, they're now demanding, if you want to showcase your brand on that online e-commerce platform, you have to be a sustainable brand. And each e-commerce platform is measuring that differently. There are different things that they take a look at, but it will be a must in the near future. So, but thank you again for all of your wonderful views. And Skandar, maybe we can continue with you, because you started talking about the African brands, and you mentioned before the situation with regards to African sourcing, and you work heavily in Africa with regards to organizing trade shows, showcasing African brands. So do you see any trends with regards to demand for African brands sourcing in Africa? What is the current situation? What do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years? Like, what does the future hold for African production, African fashion, from your perspective, again, being on the sourcing side of things?
Yeah, the trends I see today, not only at our exhibition, but the general when we speak to manufacturers, designers, etc. There's some of the trends like the local manufacturing industry that will grow up to $930 billion US dollars in Africa very soon in the coming 5 years. And then you have the potential for the e-commerce in Africa from the Africa continental free trade that is over 20 billion US dollars. That is all for the next 5 years. The problem here we see and the challenges for the African manufacturers and designers is two things. One is the China that is producing and selling in Africa for a cheaper rate. That is a huge competition to the African manufacturers. And then you have the second-hand clothes, which is coming from the Western country. Most of the time it's from US market. And in countries like Ghana, Kenya, Benin, you won't believe, but about 80% of the people wear second-hand clothes that is coming. They buy second-hand clothes. That is a killer for the African manufacturers, for the African designers who are so creative. And then another challenge in Africa is the logistic and the price and the image, which exists even if you produce the best designs and the best brands and quality. The image is still not where it belongs to be in the Western market. This has to do with the media that is happening in the Western market. If you see the media in Europe, the only time when you talk about Africa is when there is a negative news. But you won't see media which are talking about manufacturing and design in Africa. CNN does it sometimes, BBC does it sometimes, but that's all. In Germany, there is no positive news about Africa. That's what I can tell you. But whenever there is a small bomb or there is a crime going on, then you will see something about Africa. So that's an image thing. But now the situation within Africa and outside is changing. That's where I see the positive, the future here is the Africa continental free trade. So within the region, there will be more and more people selling, and this is an economy of about 3 to 3.4 trillion US dollars, and that brings 200,000 new jobs. That's what we see only in East Africa. 200,000 new jobs will be brought in the coming few years.
I'm really fascinated by the numbers that you've given us and the trends that you see. This is really, it's incredible. It really is fascinating. So Anyanga and Samata, just really briefly, in addition to what Skander has said, what are some of the factors that you see to make sustainable African fashion successful? If you had to choose like 3 main factors to make it more successful, what would you choose?
I would say I'm going to point to one because I feel like it captures a lot of things. And if we go back to the SDGs, we look at Goal 17, which is based on building partnerships and collaboration. I think we need more of that happening. It's not to say that African designers cannot do it on their own, but we do need to foster an environment of more collaborations so we can all grow together. You know, I've just finished a collaboration. It's launching later on in the summer with a sustainable footwear brand called Vivo Barefoot. They're based out here in the UK and manufacture a range of shoes in Ethiopia, where they've trained artisans to make shoes. And instead of them going and maybe, deciding to appropriate, they said, we're going to work on this particular project with an African designer and get inspiration from a culture. So I think we need to put more emphasis on collaborations
Yeah, as you said, collaborations and partnerships are key in the industry, for sure. And that's also in the Sustainable Development Goals under partnerships for goals. Absolutely. And Samara, what is your take on that? What do you think is the top 2 factors to make African sustainable fashion or sustainable fashion more successful? What would you pick?
The 2 things I would pick would be infrastructural changes. So, for example, for me, textiles are such a huge part of the supply cycle. I think without textiles, we really don't have an industry. You can't make clothes without them. And right now, the infrastructure is lacking that allows or facilitates African countries to go from like the cotton to the actual textile. And I think that in itself is kind of it's a barrier to being able to scale a huge part of what is sustainability. Like, so much of our footprint and our impact on biodiversity is in that upstream stage of production. 70% of our global greenhouse gases come from that process of literally before you even get to cutting, making and trimming. So I think getting the infrastructural support so that countries can actually go from having the seed to producing their own textiles and not having to export that seed or that fiber to another country and then buy back the finished textiles, I think is a huge part of the conversation. Bringing more of the making process into the continent means that you have more control and more influence about how those stages are rendered, from how the cutting, the dyeing, the coloring, all of those stages are part of that sustainability bit before you even get to a finished garment. So right now, I think there's a bit too much of a perception of the continent where designers are seen as like, and I hate this analogy, but we'll put enough in this designer for them to grow their stall, for them to grow their small brand, when so many designers aspire to be global multinationals or conglomerates. So I'd love the approach towards investing in sustainable brands and investing in Africa to be macro and huge, to really give it the respect it deserves, so that it can become, that these brands, these people like Anyango can become those big conglomerates that might have other brands within them, 10 years from now.
This was really fantastic. I thank all of you. And I love that it was, it was a discussion environment and not just me asking questions and each one of you answering for that question, but there was a debate, a discussion, etc., which will definitely be very interesting for the ones watching it on April 25th.